and that allows us to drag in some very cold air from the Arctic. Not quite there just yet on Sunday, and for a lot of England and Wales we remain rather cloudy but largely dry. There will be a few showers around. For Scotland and Northern Ireland, a much brighter day here than on Saturday, with a mixture of sunny spells and a scattering of showers, and some of these showers potentially will be falling as sleet and snow across the high ground. Temperatures today generally ranging between 6 to 9 degrees, so that's very similar to what we saw on Saturday. And then going into the evening, we start to see the clearer skies across the north gradually sink their way southwards towards southern England. A few showers around, but more widely across the north, with this band of rain and hail snow sinking its way towards Scotland as we go through the course of Sunday evening. And behind it, as we go into the early hours of Monday morning, some very cold air moving into Scotland, widely seeing sleet and snow across the country with the risk of some ice too. To the south of it, a colder night then of late, risk of a patchy frost in a few spots, and then that will set us up for a mixture of sunny spells and a scattering of showers across the south on Monday. But more significantly across the north, turning colder as the day goes on, widely seeing showers across Scotland turn to sleet and snow, and eventually also across parts of northern England as we go into the afternoon. So do please be aware if you are travelling across the northern half of the UK on Monday that there could be some disruption due to snow and ice. And then going forward as we move into Tuesday and Wednesday, very similar, most of us seeing some very cold conditions, risk of some snow, and not always across the north. We could just see some snow at times in the south too.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even some ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Coming up on today's Camilla Tominey show, I'm going to be speaking to Chris Heaton-Harris, the Northern Ireland Secretary, about whether Rishi Sunak's Brexit deal cuts the mustard. I'll also be speaking to Jake Berry, Boris Johnson supporter extraordinaire. Has the former Prime Minister become a bit Trumpian over Sue Gray? And Professor Carol Sikora, the cancer specialist, is going to react to the lockdown files. All that and more to come. But first, here's the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Camilla, thank you very much and good morning. It's 9:30. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. Train passengers are being hit by the largest hike in rail fares for more than a decade. Train prices across England and Wales are increasing by an average of 5.9%, which could add hundreds of pounds to annual season tickets. Rail Minister Hugh Merriman says the increase is below inflation, but Labour has called it savage. The Duke of Sussex has defended his use of drugs, saying some of them helped him mentally. During his latest streamed interview, Prince Harry spoke to trauma expert Dr. Gabor Mate, who diagnosed him with attention deficit disorder. In his memoir, Spare, Harry admitted to regular drug taking, saying he used marijuana in 2015 whilst living in the grounds of Kensington Palace. Harry also spoke about the death of his mother, Princess Diana, who died when he was just 12 years old. And more than 100 nations have completed an historic pact to protect the world's oceans. The legally binding High Seas Treaty aims to put 30% of seas into protected areas by 2030. Environmental groups say the agreement will help reverse marine losses and ensure sustainable development. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to Camilla.
Good morning and welcome to the Camilla Tominey show with me, Camilla Tominey. Don't go anywhere. The weather looks awful, right? So stay here, stay tuned. Got 90 minutes of pure political fun and games to have. It's been a pretty busy week at the Telegraph, as you can imagine. The lockdown files have dominated the news agenda. Some other broadcasters haven't really enjoyed it. GB News obviously has covered it very well because that's what we do here. So that's going to be the main source of discussion, but we're also going to be discussing Brexit and other issues, the Sue Gray fiasco. I've got Chris Heaton-Harris, the Northern Ireland Secretary, coming in. I'm going to be speaking to Jake Berry, a key Boris Johnson supporter, about what he thinks of it all. Is this privileges inquiry even going to stand up anymore? And I'll be speaking to John Ashworth, the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, about how well Keir Starmer actually knows Sue Gray. Because I think we need to know, don't we? But first of all, let's just go through the newspaper headlines. As you can imagine, the Sunday Telegraph again leads with this huge expose. If it isn't going to be scoop of the year, I don't know what is. Hancock's plan to frighten the pants off the public. We're discussing that in just a minute. Sunday Times. Putin has stolen our children. The Observer. I'll be discussing this with Jake Berry. He's gone full Trump. Tories turn on Johnson over Partygate. The Mirror. It's the royal who refuses to go away as he continues his world privacy tour. Harry's new blast at Charles. Sunday Express, again, there he is in the pictures, going off to America for privacy, and he's on the front page of the papers again. Rishi, I'll stop migrant boats, it says on the Sunday Express. And the Mail also goes with that story. Rishi, make no mistake, I'll deport Channel migrants. And the Sun on Sunday, again, Harry sums up the mood of, I think, 1 in 3 people in Britain by saying, I come from a broken home. Join the club, Harry. But not all of us complain about it ad nauseum. Now, let's bring in my newspaper guest. My Telegraph colleague, Alison Pearson, joins me now. I'm absolutely delighted to have you in the studio.
Wonderful to be here. I've been watching you and seeing The View, and now I'm here in person,
I know,
which is
we've
great.
coordinated our outfit. We're like Robin Hood's merry maids.
You be Maid Marian, I'll be Robin Hood.
Something like that. He'll be Little John. We'll find out later. Now, Alison, let's go with Scoop of the Year. I'm biased. I'm going to call it that. The lockdown files. Hancock's plan to frighten the pants off the public. Not the best thing to have said in a WhatsApp. What do you make of it all? Because I know you've done so much work on this. You've done your Planet Normal podcast. You've been one of the few journalists who have voiced concerns about the lockdown from the very beginning. So your take is really intriguing.
Well, I guess you could say it's vindication, but it's a very bittersweet vindication, isn't it, when you actually find out. I always suspected that they were quoting the science and making things up as they went along to suit a political agenda. And what the Telegraph scoop this week has revealed is, I'm afraid, that's exactly what was happening. I think today's is the worst yet.
Yeah.
Matt Hancock, Project Fear, let's scare the pants off the public with the new variant, the Kent variant. Something we know, Camilla, is that viruses tend to get weaker. They get more contagious and they get weaker. But what's coming through today from this this WhatsApp is, the naughty British public. Maybe they're getting a bit complacent. Maybe they're not behaving themselves and doing what Uncle Matt tells them. So now we're going to scare the pants off them by pretending this new variant is going to be even more lethal. Total lies. Absolute lies told by a government minister to the British people. This is hugely significant, a vast scandal, I think. But what we've seen is other journalists targeting their ire on Isabel Oakeshott.
Yes, because you pointed out Julia Hartley-Brewer, I think, has written a piece in the Telegraph where she's basically said, you know, in what world is Isabel Oakeshott this story? This story is about 100,000 messages that reveal the decision-making at the heart of government policy that affected our lives and liberties. And yet there's this huge focus on Isabel, who, let's declare a personal interest, we both know her quite well. And, you know, the BBC and others have completely lost their minds over this, probably because A, they were out-scooped, and B, they weren't really on the money in the first place. Where was the journalistic scrutiny, apart from at the Telegraph and other newspapers, when all of this was going on?
I think it's very much that Julia's saying, you know, that other journalists, a lot of other journalists didn't do the job of being journalists. I'm sure lots of viewers, GB viewers, will have watched those Number 10 press briefings and thought, hang on, why aren't you asking, is this necessary? They were all saying, we need to lock down more. Why aren't you closing schools? One of the big scoops from the Telegraph lockdown files this week is that there was pressure to keep schools closed. Millions of parents wanted the children to go to school, you know. And I think for me, what comes through all these WhatsApps is a total lack of empathy at the top, in the inner circle, for the consequences that these terrible restrictions were having on children. Couldn't kiss their parents goodbye in care homes. You know, there were kids. We have over 1 million children on mental health waiting lists now. These policies, this is the worst policy in modern British history. And it was quite right of Isabel Oakeshott to betray Matt Hancock. Matt Hancock betrayed the British people.
What should happen? I mean, I have read your Twitter feed, Alison. What do you think should happen to Matt Hancock? I mean, let's appreciate he's not here to defend himself, and he has robustly defended himself against this. He says it's only a partial view, that the lockdown files don't tell the full picture. What do you think should happen to the former Health Secretary?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I'd like to look at criminal proceedings against some of these people.
Alison, for what? How can you do that? I mean, he'll be saying, I made these policy decisions in good faith. I saw data. Hundreds of thousands of people were going to die. You can't argue with the first lockdown, surely, when we didn't know the dangers of this virus and we had to protect ourselves, and indeed not just the elderly, but at the time we were seeing images from Italy and people were dying and they were in hospital corridors.
These WhatsApps don't date from that early period. These WhatsApps date from the end of 2020 when we had got a much clearer picture about what was going on. We've not only got Hancock saying, let's scare the pants off the public. Camilla, during the Second World War, the worst crisis our country ever faced in modern times, the government didn't use propaganda against the British people. These people, and we've got Simon Case, the most senior civil servant, saying let's use fear/guilt on the British public. I think it's, I mean, I don't know. I look at the news programmes and I think, where is the outrage?
I know, it's interesting because we're going to get onto Sue Gray in just a minute, and actually Case is a decent segue because he's the Cabinet Secretary who is a permanent secretary at the time of this. And it's interesting, he talks about sort of conservative ideology around being anti or pro-lockdown. Why is he using that terminology? Is being pro or anti-lockdown a political construct? I don't think it is it?
I think it became the cause of the left. We see it in America with the Democrats. If you wore a mask, if you did what you were told, then you were virtuous. I mean, always did what I was told. I know you did it as well, because we were journalists. We couldn't afford to be seen to be breaking the rules. I thought if there were rules, everybody should obey them. But yeah, I think it became a cause of the left, although at the Telegraph and on Planet Normal podcast, we were hearing from people across the political spectrum, numerous people who knew that a lot of the data we were being given was very dodgy. And what we see in these lockdown files is Boris Johnson, to his great credit, constantly asking questions like, but if an 84-year-old gets COVID and has only a 6% chance of dying, shouldn't we give elderly people the choice? They're more at risk from falling downstairs.
The Prime Minister comes out of it except the shopping trolley analogy that Dominic Cummings coined does seem appropriate. He can't take a decision. Why does he let, as he's been described, this pipsqueak, Matt Hancock, push him around? It's like he goes and canvasses opinions and then he can't take one himself. I think that does expose him.
I think that they scared the public so successfully that then they were caught in that loop. Because what happened was the public suddenly started saying, but we want you to go on protecting us because it's so frightening. They couldn't then say, well, actually, we may have over-exaggerated how many people. I mean, I remember seeing adverts telling young people all people are equally at risk. That was a lie. That was paid for by yours and my taxes. A lie implying that young people would die of COVID in great numbers. No, not true. But anyway, look, let's celebrate, because this is a great scoop.
It's a great scoop. Now let's move on to another exclusive that's a good exclusive today in The Sun on Sunday. And this is a revelation exclusive. Bojo fury over new bias row. Partygate Sue's lad is an activist for Labour. So Sue Gray's son is not just an activist for Labour, but also campaigning in Uxbridge.
That's right, campaigning in Boris Johnson's Uxbridge seat, which is slightly at risk. Yeah, this is a staggering story. Look, we all know we have no control over our children's political opinions. I certainly don't have control over my children's political opinions, but this is really shocking. This is the senior civil servant, Sue Gray, who led the investigation, apparently impartial investigation into Partygate. It's now revealed that her son is a Labour activist. He is quoted in this Sun exclusive as saying that, oh, my mum had led the Partygate investigation into Boris Johnson. He's now campaigning in Boris's seat for Labour. Pretty astonishing stuff.
Iffy. I'm going to be speaking to Jake Berry about it in a bit.
And just to say quickly that Dan Hodges in the Mail on Sunday has a very good piece about this, calling Keir Starmer's judgment into question. He's appointed Sue Gray as his chief of staff, the woman who was recently investigating Boris Johnson. It doesn't smell very good, does it?
Really quick one on Harry and Meghan, because time is always of the essence. The cartoon you've picked out for Cartoon of the Day is, heard your father, Harry, come out, we know you're in there. Was Frogsit right, I'm going to ask you? Was this an attempt to stop them from coming to the coronation? I only say that because by throwing them out of their accommodation at Windsor, the King is basically saying, oh, sorry, if you come on May the 6th, you won't have anywhere to stay.
I'm sure there's a nice Premier Inn within spitting distance of Westminster Abbey.
Can we see Meghan in a Premier Inn, Alison?
I don't know where she's going to keep all the tiaras, Camilla. Look, I think it's very much you're invited, but, you know, please don't come, isn't it, really? There's a very strong element. My strong hunch is that William and Kate and the Queen, Camilla, another queen. We've got Queen Camilla here, another Queen Camilla. I would guess that there's a lot of pressure for if they're coming. We don't want them there. They've said these absolutely horrendous things about us. Can you imagine the atmosphere in the?
Yeah, turf them out of Windsor and put them in the cheap seats at the back might be the approach, Alison.
Absolutely.
Alison Pearson, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Absolute pleasure.
Lovely to see you. Now, let's find out what the People's Panel makes of the week's political events and what they'd like me to ask some of the ministers are having on the show. Olivia Utley is in Windsor. We chose Windsor because of the Windsor Agreement. Why not? Olivia, what are the good, merry people of Windsor saying this morning?
Hello, Camilla. Yes, I am here in Windsor with our fantastic People's Panel, and we've got some very challenging questions indeed lined up from our brilliant GB News viewers to your interviewees. But first things first, we are very lucky to be here in the Go-Go's Waterfront restaurant here in Windsor, and you can see the gorgeous marina behind me. And I'm going to introduce you now to Stu, who is the general manager here. Thank you so much, Stu, for hosting us. We're very grateful to be here. And how are things for you? How's business?
It's good. It's been a quiet winter, but business is really picking up. Very busy weekends. Struggling with the cost of food and trying to make a profit, but we're getting there slowly, thanks to our loyal residents and customers.
Oh, well, that's great to hear, and I'd love to be back here in the summer, because what a spot
really
you've got, and thank you again. And so this is our brilliant People's Panel. Today we have got Ken, we've got Sarah, and we've got Rob. And Ken, I'm going to start with you, because we were talking earlier, and you used to be a civil servant, didn't you? So what do you make of the appointment of Sue Gray as Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff? Do you think it's appropriate?
Well, he can obviously appoint who he wants to. That's his decision. However, there are broader considerations, not so much about the substance of Sue Gray, but how it actually looks in practice. There are things going back now 30 or 40 years where it's very, very clear that people have said it's not just the what, it's about how it looks and how it's perceived. And I think for someone in his position, he should seriously ask questions. Have I made the right call here? How will this look and how will this play out towards the general public? And indeed, confidence in the system itself. So I think it's a questionable at the best.
A pretty stark assessment from you there. Thank you very much, Ken. And Sarah, what do you make of that? Do you agree with that assessment? Do you think it's a bit of an own goal for Keir Starmer?
Well, I'm actually a lawyer, and Keir's a lawyer. At common law, there is a real appearance of bias here, and I think that Keir will know that. So I think it raises real questions about the impartiality of the report.
And do you think that might be quite helpful, actually, for Boris Johnson? Might we see a comeback, perhaps? We keep hearing rumours of that. And Rob, you are a dual national British and Irish citizen, and you live here in Windsor, so you seem like the perfect person to ask about the new Windsor framework. What do you make of it?
Well, in theory, I am Irish and British, English, I suppose, but I should be conflicted, but actually I'm quite at peace with the whole situation. I come from the tech sector, and I think there is an analogy which works quite well here. With Theresa May, we had a hard border down the Irish Sea. With Boris, that moved towards a firm border, and I think the potential in this agreement is that it could now move towards being a soft border. The reality is, not everybody is going to get everything they want out of this accord, but people need to coalesce on common values and use that as the basis for moving forward. Without knowing the detail, I think we have the potential to move forward. The mood music is pretty good on this from most quarters.
Thank you, that's really interesting. Nice to hear a positive message as well. And Camilla's going to be interviewing Chris Heaton-Harris, the Northern Ireland Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth, the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, and Jake Berry, the former chairman of the party. Do you have, as a panel, what are your questions to them? I'm going to start again with you, Rob.
OK, well, I suppose to Chris Heaton-Harris, it would be to really get under the skin of this agreement, and it's about the why of the agreement, not the what of the agreement, but the why. So my question to him would be, why will this, in his view, be a lasting agreement? Because that's what we need.
Thank you very much. You, Sarah?
John Ashworth? I would probably ask has Rupert Hook got the whip back after the comments that she made about Kwasi Kwarteng being superficially black? I mean, the EHRC have only just stopped investigating Labour a couple of weeks ago. Keir has said that he will operate a zero-tolerance approach
to racism, does that mean zero tolerance if you've been on a half-day training course?
Thank you very much, Sarah. Ken, we're going to come back to you in the next clip, but for now, back to Camilla in the studio.
Thanks very much for that, Olivia. Fascinating stuff. I shall try and incorporate some of those questions into my interviews. Don't forget, if you want to apply to the People's Panel, it's gbnews.uk/panel. Now, interview number 1 comes up next. Jake Berry, I think, the former chairman of the Tory party, hopefully is joining me from his constituency. Jake, can you hear me in Darwin and Washington there?
I can hear you loud and clear, Camilla.
Good man. Lovely to see you this morning. Now, let's talk about this Privileges Committee. This interim report said it should have been obvious to Boris Johnson that he was breaking the rules. He's a very educated and clever man. It should have been obvious to him, shouldn't it, Jake?
Well, Camilla, you're right. He absolutely is an educated and clever man. Look, I think lots of people watching this show would understand that the rules were in some cases so complicated, particularly here in Lancashire, where the poor old town of Bolton had 18 different sets of rules over a 2-month period, that it was quite hard, I think, for everyone to keep track of them. Look, Boris should obviously
I know, but he was the Prime Minister at the time. He was setting the rules.
But, you know, I mean, I think what you'll find is if you look at that Sue Gray report, and I'm sure we'll come on to that, is walking into a room where people gave you a slice of birthday cake, really for most people would not necessarily believe that they were attending a party within the definition of the rules. I just don't think that's how most people interpret them, and it's clearly not how Boris interpreted them.
OK, let's talk about Sue Gray then, because when the report came out, Boris Johnson said that it basically vindicated him. He seemed quite pleased with the Sue Gray report. Now he's saying that there are question marks over the Sue Gray report because of this appointment to Sir Keir Starmer's office. So which is it? Has Sue Gray vindicated him or implicated him? I'm confused.
Well, look, the Sue Gray report largely vindicated Boris Johnson. I think the point about this huge lapse of judgment that Keir Starmer's had in relation to appointing Sue Gray is, even though actually in all my dealings with her, and I worked with her when I was in the Cabinet Office, I personally have found her to be completely fair, it's this appearance of bias, this sort of appearance that Boris Johnson may have been subject to the biggest stitch-up since the bio-tapestry, as he likes to say. It's this appearance of bias which I think undermines and defeats quite a lot of the point of her report.
But aren't you undermining the civil service by suggesting that Sue Gray can't have private opinions but behave in a professionally impartial manner?
Well, as I said, in all my dealings with Sue Gray, I've always found her completely fair and impartial. But I think it plays into this bigger idea, Camilla, that, you know, the British people voted for Brexit, and I was in government and I saw firsthand civil servants at every turn trying to frustrate Brexit. The British people then voted for Boris Johnson to actually deliver the Brexit they'd voted for a couple of years earlier. And then it feels like, because of this appointment of Sue Gray, we then saw the civil service try and frustrate and remove Boris Johnson from office. So I cannot help what the civil service does and how it may be perceived by the great British public. That's for the great British public to decide. It's the civil service itself which is creating this perception. I think the appointment of Sue Gray, unfortunately, is just another brick in the wall that GB News viewers would look at it and say, you actually don't work for us, you work for yourself, you don't work for our country, you don't believe in what we believe in. And that's why I think it's a mistake to have appointed Sue Gray.
Do you think that Sir Keir Starmer should change his mind then? Do you think he should cancel the appointment?
I don't really care what Keir Starmer does. That's a matter for him. I've made my views completely clear on it. But what I would say is the appointment of Sue Gray, I think, proves that Keir Starmer is a man of the establishment. He's basically worked in the establishment his entire life, not least, as he keeps telling us, as the chief prosecutor for the UK. Any government that he heads is not going to work for the people of Lancashire, is not going to work for your GB News viewers. It's an establishment government that wants to preserve the status quo. And I got into politics to change that, to fight for the people in the north, to deliver what people want here across Lancashire and the wider north of England. Keir Starmer will not do that. He cannot do that. And Sue Gray's appointment proves it.
But if Boris Johnson is found guilty by this Privileges Committee, then the people of the north, your constituents, will say he needs to stand down as an MP.
Well, I'm not going to get into what may happen. I mean, I think the first thing with the Privileges Committee is it needs to get on with it, because we've waited a very long time. I cannot understand why we have this continuous delay. Let's deal with what the Privilege Committee says when it reports. But I think Boris Johnson has been absolutely clear. And as you started off by saying, Camilla, the Sue Gray report largely said he was vindicated and you know, although he'd made mistakes, which I think he freely admits, you know, he should have carried on as Prime Minister. I think that's what the Privilege Committee should and will find.
You're a party man through and through, Jake. I think the last time I saw you in Westminster, you were talking about Boris Johnson sort of being the answer to the Tory party's prayers come the next general election. Do you still think that? I mean, do you still think that the party is weakened without him? Or shouldn't he just shut his trap, support the Prime Minister in the interests of party unity for your party to have a hope in hell of beating Labour come 2024?
Well, Camilla, I recently made a comment which I won't repeat on GB News about prime ministerial interventions. I
like that quote. You can repeat it if you like.
Well, I think they should. Well, I can. Well, I said that interventions by former prime ministers should be like sex in a long and happy relationship, infrequent but anticipated with glee. That applies to Boris Johnson. He absolutely has a huge role to play in British public life, but I think he needs to enable Rishi Sunak to lead not just my party, but our country forward to an election victory. Look, in terms of Boris Johnson, he is a triple gold-plated, sure-fired election winner. I can't recall an election he's ever actually lost. And so I'm sure as we get nearer to the general election, he will play a huge part, not least in that campaign, but in government, going around talking to people about delivering the people's priorities.
What did Mrs Berry think about that quote, Jake?
Mrs Berry had her standard reaction to most things I had say, which is her head in the hands and saying, "Oh my God, what have you done?" She's very, very tolerant of my loose lips.
And final word, this migrant policy that Rishi Sunak is coming out with this week, you have to stop these boats, don't you? Isn't it the most important issue facing the party come the next general election?
Well, look, I go knocking on doors every single week and it's raised on most doorsteps here in Lancashire. It's a big test for Rishi. He has said not that he's going to reduce the number of boats, not that he's going to sort of start just sending people back. He has said that we will stop boats this year. I will be supporting him in that. Over 500,000 people came to our country last year, 450,000 legally. There are plenty of legal routes. Let's make sure we stop the illegal ones.
Jake, sorry to cut you off there, but we do need to go. Thank you very much for joining me this morning. Look, I'll be speaking to Jonathan Ashworth in just a minute. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back before you know it.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion,
debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even some ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today.
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Don't go anywhere. I'm going to be asking John Ashworth, the Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, in just a minute, just how well Keir Starmer knows Sue Gray. Let's try and get to the bottom of this great mystery. I'll also be speaking to Chris Heaton-Harris, the Northern Ireland Secretary, a little later in the show. But first, here's the news headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Camilla, thank you very much. It's 10 o'clock. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. Train passengers are being hit by the largest hike in rail fares for more than a decade. Ticket prices across England and Wales are increasing by an average of 5.9%, which could add hundreds of pounds to annual season tickets. Rail Minister Hugh Merriman says the increase is below inflation, but Labour has called it savage. The Independent's travel correspondent Simon Calder says the increase isn't fair when it comes to the services currently being provided.
A taxpayer who really doesn't want to pay more for what, frankly, is quite a lousy service. We heard last week, for example, that that the number of cancellations on the day is at the highest it's ever been since records began. So people are quite frankly thinking, yep, it's we're paying more and we're getting less.
The former health secretary wanted to, quote, frighten the pants off everyone. That's according to leaked messages sent during the COVID pandemic. The latest WhatsApp conversation published in the Sunday Telegraph shows Matt Hancock discussing how to use another strain of the virus to scare the public. He also seemed to take exception to NHS England's chief executive at the time, saying ousting him would be a massive improvement. The Duke of Sussex has defended his use of drugs, saying some of them helped him mentally. During his latest streamed interview, Prince Harry spoke to trauma expert Dr. Gabor Mate, who diagnosed him with attention deficit disorder. In his memoir Spare, Harry admitted to regular drug taking, saying he used marijuana in 2015 whilst living in the grounds of Kensington Palace. Now, more than 100 nations have completed an historic pact to protect the world's oceans. The legally binding High Seas Treaty aims to put 30% of seas into protected areas by 2030. Very little of the high seas is subject to any protection, with pollution and overfishing posing a growing threat. Environmental groups say the agreement will help reverse marine losses and ensure sustainable development. The Prince's Foundation, founded by the King, has partnered with luxury fashion brand Chanel to launch an embroidery course for students. 6 university graduates will be selected, receiving bursaries for living costs during the 24-week programme. Held at the King's Highgrove home in Gloucestershire, it aims to equip and prepare aspiring designers. And venues across England and Wales will be open later over the King's coronation weekend in May. Pubs, clubs and bars will serve customers for an extra 2 hours between the 5th and the 7th of May. The Home Secretary says it's so people can have time to go and enjoy an extra pint or two. This is GB News. More news for you later. Now it's back to Camilla.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. I'll be speaking to John Ashworth, the Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, in just a jiffy. I'll also be speaking later on to Chris Heaton-Harris, the Northern Ireland Secretary. And we've got Professor Carol Sikora in the studio to discuss his reaction to the lockdown files. He's a cancer specialist. He's got a lot of views on whether the cure was worse than the disease. So let's speak to him a little later. But first, Jonathan Ashworth, I hope, joins me now. John, can you hear me?
I can. Good morning.
John, are you with us? Ah, there you are. I can see you on this bright and breezy Sunday morning. Now, John, tell me this. You're saying that Labour now, and we remember the old adverts from the 1980s, Labour isn't working. You're saying that you're now the party to get people from welfare into work. How are you going to do that?
Absolutely, because I'm putting forward serious welfare reforms, because I think there are too many people who are out of work, trapped on welfare, abandoned, going nowhere, and I want to give those people hope and confidence for the future. So I've proposed reforms to the way in which disability and sickness benefits are assessed to deal with the disincentives in the system. I want to shift power and resources to local areas, to put proper support into local areas with training and reskilling that job centres deliver. And when we've got 1 million young people who are workless, and a significant proportion of that are young people who have been out of work for over 6 months, sometimes for a year, I'm saying these young people should be required to go to the job centre more often, to take on training opportunities, because if you're out of work when you're young, you risk a life on the margins, and we've got to get people back to work. In fact, you know, we've got a big plan as an incoming Labour government, if we win people's trust, to grow our economy, to sustainably raise living standards, and part of that is getting more people into jobs and into work. But Jeremy Hunt's got a budget next week. He could implement my welfare reform plan, but if he doesn't, then this is a plan we'll be putting to the public in an election.
Simple question, Jonathan. Are Labour going to put benefits up, or are they going to cut them? Because the welfare bill keeps on going up, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, we're going to be spending £8 billion more on sickness and disability related benefits. At the moment, that's under the Conservative plans, and I'm saying a lot of people who are out of work, often, look, increasingly now people are out of work for reasons of mental health, for anxiety and depression. For a lot of those people, getting into good quality work will help them with their managing their condition. Now, obviously, work's not going to be right for everybody, and you know, I think we all understand that and accept that. But there are a lot of people who say they want to work. 1.7 million people say they want to work with the right help, but they're not getting any help at the moment. That can't be right.
So you might be cutting benefits.
People into work. Well, I'm saying if you're a young person, you know, if you've been out of work for 6 months, a year, you should be required to interact with the job centre more regularly. And there are conditions attached to claiming unemployment benefits. Absolutely. But equally, I know that if you can get people into work, then that means they can build a life, provide a home, save for the future. But in the moment, people are trapped out of work. There are barriers in the system. There are barriers to parents moving into work because of the way in which universal credit operates. So we need to make universal credit work as well. So we've got detailed welfare reform proposals. It's new thinking, new reforms from Labour, which, if the government don't introduce and copy my reforms, then the Labour government will.
Let's speak about somebody who is certainly in work. She's in a new job. She's going to be Keir Starmer's new Chief of Staff. How well does Sir Keir Starmer know Sue Gray personally? And how long do you think they've been negotiating for her to take this position after leaving the civil service?
Well, I mean, Sue Gray is a woman of exceptional talent and ability. And I think it shows in the same way that senior business people are now supporting Labour, how seriously people are taking the prospect of Keir Starmer as Prime Minister and a Labour government. And in turn it shows how seriously Keir Starmer is taking preparing for government if the British public put their trust in us. Now, we've had a vacancy.
How well do they know each other, Jonathan?
I don't know the answer to that, but they're not. I don't think they're people who, socialise regularly together or anything like that.
But I think they've known each other for years, haven't they? Apparently.
Well, in as much as Sue Gray is a senior civil servant and Keir Starmer was the country's leading prosecutor, putting villains and criminals behind bars. So he would have got to know her, I'm sure, throughout those years as well. But the key thing is that she is a woman of immense integrity, and it shows how seriously people are now taking the prospect of a Labour government, that someone of that calibre is prepared to come and work for us.
But they're not taking as seriously now her Partygate probe because they think that there's something a bit iffy about her links to the Labour Party. So your party had this great thing. You had an open goal. You were scoring against Boris Johnson. He wasn't saving any of these goals because Partygate incriminated him. And now, because Keir Starmer has chosen Sue Gray as his Chief of Staff, you've undermined her Partygate report, and you've now made Boris Johnson, rightly or wrongly, look less culpable than he was. That's not good politics.
Look, the only person responsible for Boris Johnson's downfall is Boris Johnson. He was the one breaking the rules while at the same time putting this country into lockdown. As we've seen on the newspaper, you work for, we've seen the scale of what was going on behind the scenes. It's why we need a proper public inquiry, by the way. All those messages need to be passed to the public inquiry, and all needs to be looked at properly. And that inquiry, Rishi Sunak's got to get on with that inquiry. But at the end of the day, it was Boris Johnson breaking the rules. We've seen the photos, and the evidence that's going to the Parliamentary Committee isn't based on Sue Gray's report. It's based on their own witness statements under oath from people who were there. It's based on the WhatsApp and the emails that they have seen, and they think Boris Johnson misled Parliament, or they think he may have misled Parliament.
But where were you then, Jonathan? Because you were Shadow Health Secretary. The lockdown files have revealed that there was virtually no opposition to cavalier decision-making and government via WhatsApp. So where were you? Where was Keir Starmer? Where was the opposition questioning the likes of Matt Hancock? You just followed everything the government came up with hook, line and sinker.
We raised concerns throughout that process. In fact, if you remember, back in March, when we went into lockdown, Camilla, you warned me not to play political games, and you pointed out that I was doing one of my interviews with a vintage Labour poster in my background when I was raising concerns, for example, about the lack of sick pay for people who needed to self-isolate. That was in March 2020. You said the country would not forgive Labour if they play political games with this.
Applying scrutiny and asking questions of governmental decision-making isn't playing political games. You can politicise a pandemic, and that's a bad thing to do. But journalists like me were asking questions. You were Shadow Health Secretary. Why weren't you asking those questions? Instead, you just rubber-stamped everything the government did.
Well, I was.
But you supported all of the government's COVID policy.
That's what your article said in March 2020. No, I was asking questions. I was asking questions about sick pay.
But even later, when the second lockdown, the third lockdown, you weren't questioning it at all, even though there were concerns over the data.
We were. We questioned the failure to protect care homes. We questioned sick pay, as you rightly identified in your article you wrote about me. We questioned the failure around why areas were not getting more vaccination sooner. We were questioned why areas like Leicester, which I live in, as you know, and other parts of the country were placed in longer lockdowns. We were raising concerns throughout, but equally, we also knew, or also we took a judgment that if the government and the chief scientific advisors were asking us not to vote against the government's lockdown legislation, then we wouldn't do that because we didn't want to let the virus rip as some others did. So look, right, this is why all of the messages need to be properly investigated by an inquiry. I think those who have rightly pointed out that other countries have had their inquiries, why haven't we? That's absolutely right. Rishi Sunak now needs to make sure that this inquiry that they get on with it, that we have some form of preliminary report by the end of the year, that ministers hand over all of their messages, that ministers aren't deleting everything, because we do need to learn lessons from what was, in many ways, not entirely unprecedented, because pandemics have hit us in the past, but certainly unprecedented in most people's lifetimes.
But are you saying that you agree with Isabel Oakeshott when she has raised concerns about the inquiry being a whitewash, but also this notion of justice delayed being justice denied then?
I absolutely agree with Isabel Oakeshott on her point about timing. I still have confidence in the people running the inquiry, so I will not associate myself with that bit of her comment, but I certainly agree on timing. We need to get on with this. If other countries have had their inquiries, why haven't we? I mean, I think it took it a year even to get the terms of reference agreed. I mean, that's a nonsense. But we've got to learn lessons. And by the way, look, I totally appreciate people have different points of view on this, and that's quite right. You know, people should have different points of view. But it's why actually, in the end, you need an inquiry to look at all the ins and outs of this. And so we can learn lessons and prepare ourselves should anything awful like this hit us again.
Final quick question, because I know you knew him well and obviously you worked in very close quarters. What should happen to Matt Hancock now? Alison Pearson, my newspaper reviewer, was talking about criminal charges. That might be a bit of a stretch, but how do you think this leaves the former Health Secretary?
Well, gosh, I wasn't expecting that question. Perhaps I should have done. Well, I mean, his political career's over, isn't it? I think the key thing is that he accounts for himself in front of an inquiry. It comes back to this point, doesn't it? Why we need this inquiry to take place quickly. A lot of people lost their lives. There's a lot of people who think that the way in which lockdowns operated has had long-term implications on all kinds of fronts.
Yeah.
Everybody wants an inquiry because everybody wants to be able to see the evidence, to be able to debate it properly and calmly, and it's why we need to get on with it.
Jonathan Ashworth, thank you very, very much for joining me this morning. Now, let's go to Olivia Utley. She's in Windsor. She's with our People's panel. Really intrigued to find out what they make of all this, Olivia. What are they saying there?
Well, thank you very much, Camilla. Yes, without further ado, I'll throw you over to the People's panel. I'm going to start with Ken, because we didn't get to him last time. Ken, what did you make of what Jonathan Ashworth and Jake Berry had to say there?
Well, it was all very interesting, and they covered the points as they through their respective political perspectives. But there's two outstanding questions for me. One, for both of them, why is it, 30 years after we started to see all the various allegations of sleaze in the major Blair years occurring, with the Nolan Committee and the reports on standards, why is it 30 years later we are still having discussions about, sleaze? Have neither party learned anything from the recent events, and why is it still going on? And also to Jonathan Ashworth, the question I've got, and it really concerns me on this one, is do not Labour appreciate it is not what you actually do, it is how it is perceived by the general public. He said that they're looking, they're prepared for government and things like that, and I know they trotted out Deborah Meaden or something this week to say that there's the voice of business, but it's how it's perceived, and I think people will say, oh, it looks like a stitch-up. So he does need, and Labour need, to address the perception, and that's been consistently repeated over the years. It's, by to so many politicians, what lessons are Labour going to learn from this?
Thank you very much. I can see you nodding your head there, Sarah. What did you make of it all?
I'm coming back to the never-ending Brexit story, Olivia, the rather grandly named Windsor Agreement. It was interesting to see what Jake Berry had to say on that. I guess when Chris Heaton-Harris comes on later, perhaps Camilla will be asking him whether or not the Stormont break will get the DUP back around the table.
Yeah. Do you think it's important that it's the whole of the UK that signs up to the break?
It's something that Rishi seems to have pulled off in the last 12 months, what many in the cabinet have been trying to pull off for the last 12 months. The ice seems to be thawing between us and the EU, and Ursula von der Leyen referred to him as Dear Rishi, so maybe they've forgiven us.
Do you think that might help the Conservatives' electoral prospect?
Well, I think we have to think together as a country, don't we, about what's best for the country. Yeah, maybe, who knows.
Thank you very much. And on to you, Rob. I know you have a burning question here.
Well, it's a comment, really. Camilla bowled, if I may say very skillfully, a series of leg breaks and googlies at Jonathan Ashworth, and I'm afraid he flailed the bat at the ball and didn't connect with any of them, sadly for him. And I think he's potentially in danger of doing what a lot of Labour front benchers do, which is they focus on the symptom end of the problem, but not the actual root cause of the problem. And a case in point is talking about creation of jobs. Well, if Jonathan is believing that they're going to solve that by opening more job centres and frog marching young people into them to sign up for jobs, he's completely ignoring the creation of jobs. And you create jobs in this country by incentivising business, incentivising the private sector, and that is done through lowering taxes, making outward investment attractive to the country and growing business, and that will create the jobs. So that's a classic case of focus on the root cause and the symptoms will magically start to fix themselves.
That's a really interesting point you make, because of course we're coming up to the budget and we're expecting to see corporation tax rise in that budget. What do you make of that?
It's the wrong move, and it's surprising coming from a Conservative government. The Chancellor has the mic in his hand right now, and Jeremy Hunt is planning to raise corporation tax. That is a mistake. We should be doing the opposite. Yes, we have to have fiscal responsibility, and I believe that they've put that back on track. But we have to lower taxes to incentivise business, to create jobs and prosperity for the country. It couldn't be simpler.
Thank you very much, Rob, and I can see some nods from the rest of the panel here, so at least we've got some agreement here in Windsor. But for now, back to you, Camilla, in the studio.
Thank you very much for that, Olivia. This is why I love the People's Panel, because, of course, Rob, I shall be asking Chris Heaton-Harris about corporation tax, and Sarah, yes, I'll be asking him too whether the Brexit deal is all smoke and mirrors. In just a moment, I'm going to be speaking to the cancer specialist Carol Sikora about the lockdown files and how cancer care has been affected by the pandemic. Don't go anywhere, we'll be back shortly.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions are, those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, The People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it. Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Now I'm joined by Professor Carol Sikora, oncologist and leading lockdown critic. Naturally, Professor, I want to ask you for your reaction to the lockdown files. I know you've read them because I've seen you tweeting about them. What are your initial thoughts about that investigation?
I was pretty horrified and really look forward to the public inquiry, but it'll be a whitewash. People are backtracking, trying to say, oh, I never said that. The WhatsApps that were released this week, that shows the sort of level of thinking, the level of incompetence at a medical level.
Why do you say the inquiry will be a whitewash? Because Lady Hallett, who's chairing the inquiry, says absolutely not, that they're going to look at everything very comprehensively, that they have a time frame. She doesn't like this idea that people are prejudging the inquiry. It's not fair to. I mean, she's going into this with her eyes open and wants to try and be as comprehensive and inclusive as possible, doesn't she?
I think that may be the case, but the people have moved on. The Prime Minister, Health Minister, they've all moved on. The advisors have moved on. So they don't really stand to lose anything. And it would be different if a consultant in a hospital, an oncologist like myself, was accused of doing something wrong 3 years ago. And then there was an inquiry and you were found at fault. Your career would be at stake. But it's not here. And that's perhaps the biggest problem with the inquiry.
Let me just read one of your tweets back to you, because I was intrigued by this. You said, I avoided individual criticism of politicians during the pandemic, but I'm going to make my first exception. Hancock was a poor health secretary pre-COVID and an even worse one during. The way cancer was pushed to one side was unforgivable, not a legacy to be proud of. Has the lockdown files then made you even more negative in your thinking about the health secretary? How would you evaluate his performance during the pandemic?
Very poor. It was poor before, and most health ministers struggle with it because they have no expertise in healthcare by definition when they come into power. Very few are medically qualified. And the problem they have is that the NHS is such a huge mess, basically, and no one can touch it because we're all in love with our NHS.
But shouldn't we be? I mean, the NHS is where we turn when we're in our darkest hour, and oftentimes, I know the media focuses on the negative stories, the NHS on a minute-by-minute basis is saving people's lives.
It's fantastic. Major trauma, the best place to be in Europe. Cancer, when it works, when you can access the system, fantastic care. Heart disease, the same. You can have stent operations put in if you have a heart attack all around the country now. So we are very good. What's not so good is access to it, starting with the GP, then going to emergency rooms where you wait hours before you get seen. A lot of people are put off by this. And British people are very stoic, especially men. They have a high threshold before something really troubles them enough to do something about it. It's been helped by 111, the telephone answering service, but it's not all the way. And we've got to encourage people to use the service. And of course, what lockdown did was scare the pants off.
Let's talk about that, frighten the pants off. Did it frighten the pants off cancer patients?
It did. There's no doubt. The problem, first of all, was getting the first appointment with the GP. Without that, you couldn't proceed. 111 could do so much, but it would end up telling you, go and get an appointment with your GP. If you couldn't do that, you were sort of stuck. You had to be referred for a scan or for a biopsy from a hospital, which meant you had to go through primary care because the system works with a gatekeeper. The GP is essentially the gatekeeper to the whole empire of the NHS. So that was the problem.
Did you feel that there was a sense to which GPs had gone AWOL during the pandemic? I mean, you can understand it from a public health point of view. You don't want to have a load of largely elderly people in a doctor's surgery mingling amongst themselves in the first wave. They had to do something, didn't they, to create a barrier between patients spreading it among themselves?
I think GPs Many of them handled it extremely well. A few consultants, handled it badly and used the opportunity to take holiday and so on. But I think the problem is exactly as you say. You couldn't actually walk into a GP surgery anymore. It was very restricted. I remember collecting a prescription for a neighbour, and I had to get the piece of paper out of it, and they shouted at me as I came through the door because there was a line and you weren't meant to cross the line. I hadn't been there for years, so I didn't know you had to do that. It was that sort of fear, and the adverts in the papers every day, especially the one at Piccadilly Circus with the woman with the mask on that was clearly dying, and it was though your fault because you're not obeying the rules that this has happened to this poor lady. And it was, of course, an actress, but even still, it was fear-inducing, and I think that was what was wrong with this.
Can we kind of calculate how many missed cancer diagnoses there might have been?
The only way we can do it, Camilla, is retrospectively in 2 or 3 years' time when we can look at the death rate for cancer. It takes a long time before you start seeing the curve go up.
But what's your fear? I mean, obviously you're now coming into this post-pandemic, and I did some interviews at Bart's recently, and the head of breast cancer surgery there was saying that she was finding people had presented too late with conditions that, had they presented earlier, would have been much more easy to deal with. Also saying about younger people coming, I don't know whether that's a trend.
It is, and the cancer is a strange disease. 90% of people can be cured if it's early, if it's stage 1. That's confined to the organ it arises: breast, lung, colon, prostate. But if it goes to stage 3, goes to nodes elsewhere in the body, the lymph nodes elsewhere in the body, then it drops to 25%. And stage 4, less than 10% for most cancers. So this is the problem.
And these waiting lists, I mean, what are you experiencing on a personal basis with your own patients, and what's the general picture of cancer care? I mean, these waiting lists seem to me not just months long, but in times years long. It's going to take years to clear them.
The biggest problem is getting into the system, getting the diagnosis made, getting the scan, getting the endoscopy where tubes are put down. The time from diagnosis to treatment, the target is 62 days, which is very generous, and that's 2 months. I mean, you'd sue in America if you had to wait 2 months for cancer treatment, knowing you had cancer.
Yes.
And that's the target, and it's missed in something like 40% of patients at the moment, and that's just not good enough.
Final question, Professor. There was some criticism in today's paper from the WhatsApp messages of Sir Simon Stevens, some quite unpleasant remarks that were made about Matt Hancock, about his management of the NHS. Do you concur with that? What's your reaction to that, briefly?
I thought Simon Stevens was a breath of fresh air. He came from the States. He was English, but he came from the States, having run a big insurance company, the health insurance company. I think he was very effective.
Did he deserve to be trashed in these messages?
No, he really didn't. I think it was incompetent people, on the whole, try to trash competent people, and that's probably what happened.
Thank you very much for joining me this morning, Professor Sikora. Lovely to see you. Now, coming up, I'm going to be speaking to Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris. But first, here's the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Camilla, thank you and good morning. It's 10:31. I'm Tatiana Sanchez. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. Train passengers are being hit by the largest hike in rail fares for more than a decade. Train prices across England and Wales are increasing by an average of 5.9%, which could add hundreds of pounds to annual season tickets. Rail Minister Hugh Merriman says the increase is below inflation, but Labour has called it savage. The Duke of Sussex has defended his use of drugs, saying some of them helped him mentally. During his latest streamed interview, Prince Harry spoke to trauma expert Dr. Gabor Mate, who diagnosed him with attention deficit disorder. In his memoir, Spare, Harry admitted to regular drug taking, saying he used marijuana in 2015 whilst living in the grounds of Kensington Palace. Harry also spoke about the death of his mother, Princess Diana, who died when he was just 12 years old. And more than 100 nations have completed an historic pact to protect the world's oceans. The legally binding High Seas Treaty aims to put 30% of seas into protected areas by 2030. Very little of the high seas is subject to any protection, with pollution and overfishing posing a growing threat. Environmental groups say the agreement will help reverse marine losses and ensure sustainable development. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The people's channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on this Sunday morning. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris in the studio. Of course, Chris, I need to ask you about the Windsor Framework. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to just quote Richard Littlejohn in the Daily Mail.
Sure.
He said it shouldn't be called the Windsor Framework, it should be called the Barbara Windsor Framework, all front and no knickers. Is this actually just a smoke and mirrors job? Because we haven't heard from Brexiteers that they like it. The DUP are holding their council. You're saying it's this great deal. Why hasn't it got the support of your own party?
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, I think it's got quite broad support, and certainly business groups and others in Northern Ireland definitely support it. However, I mean, I used to chair the European Research Group. Like a unionist community and other Eurosceptics, I felt I've been burned a couple of times in the past, and so was determined not to make the mistakes that have been made in the past by bouncing people into things and whatever. So we published everything on Monday, legal text, control paper. We're giving everybody as much space and time as they need to understand that actually this is way more than what Richard Littlejohn described it as. There's treaty changes in here that the European Union has to do. There's massive legal text law, EU law that's essentially being there's a whole host of things in here that actually, as a Eurosceptic, I was always told the ratchet effect of European law only went one way. It's going the other way here. There are lots and lots of principle and indeed practical things in here, but it does take a bit of reading.
But you've got Sir Cash, who, let's face it, is the ultimate veteran Eurosceptic. He's written in the Telegraph today and he's quite sceptical. They've got their star chamber of lawyers looking at it. As you know, all of these documents are open to legal interpretation. What's interesting is the UK's interpretation obviously differs from the EU's. My colleague James Crisp has done this piece this morning about Maros Sefcovic telling his own EU committees, his Brussels committees, oh, well, actually, it doesn't hand back full sovereignty. And, oh, no, the Stormont break, it's quite limited. Well, so which is it?
To be fair, the Stormont break is quite limited because it only applies to, because we've got rid of a huge swathe of EU law, it's quite limited to the 3% that remains for Northern Ireland. EU law hasn't actually diverged much from ours at this point in time. We've only left the European Union recently, and there's been a bit of COVID stuff going on in between. But it will in the future, and that's what the Stormont break is for, in that very limited slice of EU law that's left, which gives Northern Ireland businesses access to the European single market. That's why the Stormont break's there. So there is a veto, and it is a veto, if used and goes all the way through the system that two parties, 30 MLAs triggering this process, then I think when people actually read that and understand that the batch of EU law that's left is just limited to allowing access to businesses to the single market, they'll understand why that's actually quite pragmatic.
But do you agree that the DUP are going to struggle with this idea that they haven't got full sovereignty over Northern Ireland, and therefore if this deal doesn't bring Stormont back together, then what's the point of it? It will have been a failure.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the main points of this is to solve the problem for the unionist community. It wasn't just Democratic Unionist Party politicians; it was the unionist community who could not see. If you came across to Great Britain, they saw different goods on the shop shelves and supermarket shelves because people were not moving goods across the Irish Sea because of the protocol of what they saw was in it. You couldn't reduce VAT on solar panels as a government across the whole of the United Kingdom. All those things solved. And future problems that were going to come from the protocol, parcels which was going to be subject to full customs in the not too distant future, being able to move your pets around.
Okay,
but
if the unionists don't support it, and indeed the Brexiteers that you're very close to because of your former status in the ERG, then it's going to be really politically difficult for the Tory party to get it across the line, potentially. I mean, I'm sure it'll pass with Labour support, but I mean politically to get it across the line if you don't have those key caucuses of support.
Yeah, and I'm not in that place to say, oh yes, everybody's going to be on board, and actually.
Does it matter if the Brexiteers aren't on board?
No, of course. I want everybody to be on board, but I do want everybody because of what's happened in the past. I completely understand the reticence and the wanting to go through the detail, which is why I welcome it. I genuinely welcome it because there is way more in this than I think people initially give it credit for. And as I say, there's some very high-level principle things that we've never been able to achieve before, even when we're members of the European Union. And indeed, it guarantees Northern Ireland's place in our union as we move forward.
Can I move on to other matters and talk to you about civil service impartiality? We've had a couple of reports today about Simon Case's involvement in some of the WhatsApp files that the Telegraph have exposed. At one point, he talks about lockdown positions being conservative ideology. People have questioned why he used that terminology. Do you still have faith in Simon Case as Cabinet Secretary?
Yeah, I do, actually. I've worked with him quite closely. I was government chief whip under Boris for a period of time, and he's always given me completely independent and professional advice. So, yeah, I absolutely do.
OK, and then do you have faith in the fact that Sue Gray was impartial when she did her Partygate report, now that you know she's going to become Keir Starmer's chief of staff?
So, well, I've worked with Sue Gray in my role as Northern Ireland Secretary, and she's always been completely proper and professional in my dealings with her. Labour politicians in the past have raised lots of questions about civil servants who've immediately moved into positions on the other side of the fence, poacher turned gamekeeper type place, or gamekeeper turned poacher maybe, in the past. So I can understand why it's raised eyebrows. I think the simplest way to solve this situation is for Keir Starmer and his team just to publish all the information, all the messages and stuff they had with Sue Gray at that time, because I think I'd like to think everything would be completely above board. This can move on.
Full transparency. What would you like to be published?
Well, I think the way to clarify this is for Keir and his team just to publish all the interactions between them and Sue Gray at the time of this questionable time, because I'm quite sure what will come out of that will be there is nothing.
And if it isn't, what if it's revealed that Sue Gray and Keir Starmer are close and they were in communications during the Partygate inquiry and all that?
Well, I think it will prove the opposite actually, but I think we do need that clarification.
Generally, are you concerned about the effect on the Conservative Party of these lockdown files? They don't cast Matt Hancock in a particularly good light. You worked under Boris Johnson. He does live up to his reputation, as Dominic Cummings described him, as a shopping trolley. He takes opinions and canvasses opinions. He can't seem to take a decision. He then gets pushed around by the likes of Michael Gove and Matt Hancock. Who was really running the country through the pandemic? Because it doesn't seem it was Boris Johnson.
Yeah, no, I think it was Boris Johnson.
Was it?
But I'm afraid, I'm quite sure it was Boris Johnson. I wasn't in the room at that point in time, so, or actually I wasn't even on the remote Zoom at that point in time.
Well, isn't that a problem then?
But no,
because the wider cabinet weren't consulted on a lot of this decision making.
No, I don't think that's true actually. Because
you rubber stamp stuff, but you were given fait accompli.
No, that's not true either. There are cross cabinet committees that met virtually all the way through this, all decisions were taken properly. All decisions.
Were you in any of them?
I was in a handful of ones involving transport.
But the COVID-O and the COVID other group, what happened was this decision-making shrunk down to basically Hancock, Gove, Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson and a few key advisors. The wider cabinet weren't really involved in any of the major decision-making.
So I'm not sure that is true, and that's why you actually probably need the inquiry to demonstrate this, because I did attend some COVID-O meetings when it came to transport, and I did very much articulate a particular view, which was the view of my officials and my judgment on measures at the time.
Did Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out policy spread coronavirus, and does he now have questions to answer? That's what Hancock said. He was his colleague.
What you're seeing, I think, in Matt's messages, as I say, all decisions were taken and recorded by civil servants and taken properly and all that sort of stuff. What you're seeing, I think, is what you've never seen before, and you wouldn't be able to see it for previous pandemics, certainly, is a kind of Matt's thinking at the time, behind the scenes, what is going through his head.
Fighting like sort of snakes in a viper's nest. It's extraordinary, isn't it, for Hancock to be having a go at Sunak for a policy that was meant to help businesses?
Yeah, and I mean, the government at the time...
It's embarrassing, isn't it?
The government at the time was trying to both protect the NHS, protect British people, protect the economy. It was, and these are unbelievably difficult things at a time.
Why was Hancock trying to undermine the Chancellor?
And remember, on the reports that we've had today, this was pre-vaccine when testing was limited. It was really generally difficult, and each government,
it's embarrassing, though.
But each government department has its own views, and each minister has its own views, and you come to a collective decision, and when you've taken that collective decision, that is what's delivered, and that is the process of government. Now, what you're seeing is kind of like this. This is the meat before it gets to the sausage making.
But do you recognise some of the, a lot of antagonism has come to the fore here? Do you recognise that was going on at the time? Did you know that? Did you know that you had Hancock briefing against Sunak and all the rest of it?
I didn't, but I'm quite sure
You're
that...
shocked by that?
Am I shocked? I know we're all human beings in politics. We all have our own opinions, so I'm not surprised that people have different opinions.
Final quick question, your opinion on tax, because we've got a story in the Telegraph today saying dozens of US firms steer clear of UK following Hunt's tax raid. He's taxing businesses particularly too much, isn't he? And he needs to scrap this corporation tax hike, otherwise businesses won't be investing in Britain. You must be worried about that.
Well, I'm glad I'm not the Chancellor, because I think it's a proper dilemma.
If you were, would you cut the corporation tax
That's a good
hike?
question. I'd like to see...
Straight answer would be great.
I can't give you it because I don't know the whole situation.
Would you? Well, OK, let's put it this way. Do you agree with corporation tax going up by 6%?
So I agree that I was, I'm very lucky to have been a student of Art Laffer in the time, and I do believe there is a sweet spot where you get more tax in at a decent rate.
We can't be in the Laffer sweet spot if US businesses are ditching Britain in their droves.
I don't believe that's the case either, because I know of US businesses investing in Northern Ireland, and that sits on a border with a country that has a corporation tax of 12.
As a Brexiteer, you'd be loving a corporation tax that low, wouldn't you? You must be looking at Ireland. You're there all the time, looking at the Republic. They're getting inward investment. They're making films. They're making TV shows. We're here. We're saying to people who want to invest, oh, we're going to tax you 6% more. It's complete madness, isn't it?
Well, there's also a global corporation tax that's likely to kick in at some point.
But shouldn't we be more competitive against France and Germany? What's the point of Brexit otherwise?
Well, let's see. I think this will work in the future.
Do you think he's going to cut this corporation tax?
I've literally no idea.
But would you like him to?
Come
on, Minister.
Because I don't know the whole picture, it's really difficult.
Just a personal preference.
My personal, very, very personal preference. My gut would say yes, but I don't know the whole picture.
Yes to scrap it.
Not
to scrap the hike.
Scrap the hike to have a competitive corporation tax.
All right. Thank you very much indeed. That's Chris Heaton-Harris, the Northern Ireland Secretary. Now, Arlene Foster, former First Minister for Northern Ireland and GB News presenter from 11, who is covering Portillo's show, was just listening to that interview. What did you make of what Chris Heaton-Harris had to say?
Hi, Camilla. Good to be with you. And looking forward to speaking to Jeffrey Donaldson on my show at 11 o'clock. And no doubt we'll be talking about that Chris Heaton-Harris interview, which you've just conducted, and in particular what he thinks of Maros Sefcovic's comments reported in the Daily Telegraph today in relation to the fact that he thinks the Windsor Framework was simply designed to avoid negative headlines in the UK press and would not hand back full sovereignty to the UK over Northern Ireland. So that's a very interesting take on the Windsor Framework. I would imagine a very unhelpful take from the UK government's point of view, but I'll be asking Jeffrey Donaldson about that this morning, as well as all my other guests. So look forward to seeing you at 11.
Really looking forward. Really looking forward to that, Arlene. Always good to get your view. Good weekend to have you on covering Portillo. Please do tune into that show at 11. But first, it's the generation gap. It's my favourite section of the show, so I just get excited about it, Carol. I'm joined by Carol Malone, columnist and TV presenter, and Benjamin Butterworth, journalist extraordinaire. We were all together, weren't we, on Friday night? Sorry to bring our social lives into it.
No, it was very good.
Dan Wootton's 40th. Yeah. I had a bit of a problem the next morning because I was screaming to ABBA Revival.
But we couldn't hear ourselves. There was hundreds of people in that room.
It was good fun. It was good fun. Now,
very good fun.
Let's get on to the subject of the generation gap. Can we agree that, Carol, you are old enough to be Benjamin's mother?
I'm probably old enough to be his grandma.
Right, yeah. Glad you've said
At
that,
least.
not me.
Yes, I mean, my mother's actually only 40, so...
Oh, shut it's me. It's happening here. Right, now, we're going to discuss, because he's the man of the moment again. We can't get away from him. Boris Johnson, was he a good PM? Let's start with Ben.
No, he wasn't a good Prime Minister.
Oh, come now. He won a big mandate. He's got an 80-seat majority. I appreciate it's been squandered, but the man's electoral gold dust.
And doesn't that show just what a poor Prime Minister he was, that he's not in post 3 years later? You know, Boris Johnson is much better at getting rid of Prime Ministers than he is being Prime Minister. I think that's his real skill. And the truth is that he managed to get that big majority, although if you put it in the context of Tony Blair, it was nothing like as popular as Tony Blair was in terms of the number of seats that he won. And
that all worked out well, by the way,
yes.
Ben. But yes,
and he managed to lose the trust of the country consistently last year until he stepped down. The vast majority of the British public, over 60% in every poll for 6 months, wanted him to go.
When can I come in and get him?
Can
I come in and get him right now?
He managed to lose the faith of his own MPs, and he managed to lose the faith of many international allies. How is that a good Prime Minister?
Boris will always be the Prime Minister who brought about Brexit, the biggest decision any government has made this century. He was the Prime Minister who presided over COVID, the worst pandemic to hit this country in 100 years. He was the Prime Minister who oversaw the worst collapse of growth in 300 years in this country. And, you know, in 100 years' time, people will talk about him as a person of consequence and interest. And it is incredible that even now, well, before I get to that, he got the Red Wall. He was the only Tory Prime Minister ever to get the Red Wall.
He did get the Red Wall.
He got the Red Wall.
And he lost the Red Wall.
No,
as well.
he didn't lose the Red Wall.
The Red Wall. We don't know if it's lost yet.
But if it is lost, it's not about him. It's about the Red Wall looking at what the Tory party did to itself, eating itself alive. That's why they're not going to vote for them. But I think the bottom line is he is when I look at politics now, without him in it, it's dreary. Everyone in the Tory party who was going to replace him, or the people who were standing, were dreary. Penny Mordaunt doesn't have his character. She doesn't have his flair. Rishi certainly doesn't. And Rishi, since Rishi's been in power, he's like, people say he's the quiet man working behind the scenes. You know, he's the man he's the where the hell is he man. He's never there.
Invisi Rishi. Let's bring Ben back in. He's electoral catnip. We had a former party chairman, Jake Berry. I appreciate he's a supporter, but he was basically saying, look, this is the only guy that can win the general election for the Conservatives, regardless of his critics, Ben. Well, he is catnip to some sections of Britain.
I mean, I think it reveals a poverty of expectations of our politicians if Boris Johnson, who is a
You've been so insulting to voters. It wasn't the politicians who voted Boris into power. Yeah, it was the people of this country.
Come on, lots of people, I know you don't, but lots of people felt he had the Boris factor, that he, like the beer, reached parts that others can't.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I would defend Rishi Sunak or Theresa May to some extent, particularly Theresa May, because I think they are respectable. They have the interests of public office. They're honest and decent, even if I don't agree with some of their conclusions. Boris Johnson is dishonest, and I think that someone like that is uniquely unsuitable to be Prime Minister.
Do you really think, Benjamin, that the people who were pushing him out of power, and let's face it, this was a coup between Labour and Remainers. Do you really think they gave a damn about a few glasses of wine being taken and down the street? They saw all Partygate as an excuse to get him out, and they used that excuse.
Carol, I think that's really... No, Carol, hang on, let me pick you up on that, because I think that's really insulting to most of the British people.
Well, you just did it by saying that they were stupid and voting him in.
Rude. I didn't say they were stupid at all, but I think that's rude to the people, because most people followed the rules, even if they didn't like it. And I remember when Partygate was happening, I went round all the Red Wall seats doing vox pops for the newspaper.
I get all of that.
And overwhelmingly, people who had voted for Boris Johnson in these red wall seats were furious at him.
Yes,
my late grandmother who loved Boris Johnson and has always voted Conservative. She couldn't stand
one thing at a time.
She couldn't stand him because he was dishonest, and that's what matters. That is a basic that should come before party politics.
Are you really so naive that you think all politicians are honest?
No, I think he's the most dishonest.
What I think is interesting is that, recently when Zelensky came, I thought it was interesting that Zelensky spoke about Boris, talked about him like he was still PM. He was actually praising Boris, and I think that's the thing now. He is still, you called him catnip, he's exactly that. He's electoral gold. And since he's gone, you would think that the Tories would have picked up. Maybe, they haven't. Labour was 28 points ahead. And there was a poll done last week saying
it shrunk a bit, to be fair. There was a Savanta poll last week that just put Labour 14 points ahead.
But they also said if there was an election tomorrow, that the Tories would only have 30 seats in Parliament. I mean, that would be unprecedented electoral
You do
oblivion.
appreciate as well, Carol, I think, surely, that there are some people who are put off the Conservative Party by Boris Johnson. They might be more of a kind of home counties persuasion, metropolitan Londoners, but at the same time, some people absolutely have a visceral hatred of this man.
I do know that, and I think they're the people who are pushing him out. I think you've got to look at politicians for their energy, the excitement that they create, and I think Boris will be talked about in 100 years as a landmark prime minister, a man who brought a landslide victory to this country.
It is a problem for the left, isn't it, Benjamin? That probably the only person with personality on that shadow front bunch is Angela Rayner. She's not going to get anywhere near the levers of power. Keir Starmer's like vanilla. People are like meh.
I mean, I think Wes Streeting has a great deal of personality, actually.
The most ambitious man in the Labour Party.
Yeah, I think Wes Streeting is excellent.
He's not leader, though, is he?
I think he will be one day.
Right.
But I think the truth about Boris Johnson is that he's all bang and no book. So he is a brilliant speaker. If I were to get invited to a keynote speech or have him an after-dinner occasion, I'd be delighted.
All bore and no balls. I mean,
yes, exactly. Oh, good phrase. I'm going to pinch that.
But I actually think a lot of people have got quite fundamental problems now of trying to pay their bills and keep their jobs and things. I think they're quite grateful for someone who's serious rather than silly, and that's what we've had. And I would just point out.
Just look at what's happened this week with Starmer. Just look at what's happened with Sue Gray and Starmer this week. Starmer has been chasing Sue Gray. How noble and how moral is that?
Yes, how noble or how moral is that, Benjamin? That's a good question.
But that's a decision for Sue Gray rather than for Keir Starmer.
No, it's not Keir Starmer.
He knows exactly what he's doing.
What Keir Starmer has done is hired someone who is widely regarded as exceptionally capable.
Undermined. I put this to Jonathan Ashworth. He's undermined the value of the Partygate investigation into Boris Johnson. He's now caused a question mark to be hanging above it because of his appointment of Sue Gray. Was she impartial or wasn't she? That's a spectacular own goal politically.
I mean, I remember the guest you just had on, Arlene Foster, talking about how when Sue Gray was running Northern Ireland, she was exceptional and she was very fair. And so I don't think anyone disputes that her assessment of Boris Johnson was reasonable at the time.
Why isn't Keir Starmer telling us when he first started to court Sue Gray? He's been boasting for months now of how long he's known her and that he offered her the job months ago. We need to know exactly when, because that would compromise her Partygate report entirely.
But look, I think all of that is trying to find excuses to defend the things that Boris Johnson did.
No, it isn't. He was pushed out because of Partygate.
We know that Boris Johnson is a liar.
Finished 3 cabinet ministers and a prime minister. So we have to know that the person writing that report was a person of unimpeachable integrity, and now that has been thrown into
everyone,
question.
Tories or DUP or Labour said it at the time.
Need to leave it there. Thank you very much, my generation gappers. I'm, of course, back next week at 9:30. But up next, it's Arlene Foster.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament